They thought the world only saw a fairy tale. The perfect couple, the royal rebels, the storybook romance that captured hearts around the globe. But behind the polished photos, the smiles at public events, and the carefully curated headlines, a storm was brewing. A storm so intense that the very staff who served them daily feared for their sanity. Did anyone really know the truth about Meghan and Harry? Or were we all being blinded by a glittering facade of fame, wealth, and influence? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. From the outside, it seemed like a dream. Meghan Markle, the Hollywood actress who captured the attention of a prince, and Prince Harry, the royal who finally seemed free of centuries of expectation, were a modern love story come to life. Every move was scrutinized, every gesture dissected by the press. But what if I told you that the real story, what went on behind closed doors, was darker, messier, and far more shocking than anyone could have imagined? That what the cameras never saw, what the public never heard, was a marriage on the brink of collapse, fueled not by love, but by tension, fear, and relentless ambition. It started subtly. Small incidents, little cracks in the foundation. A sharp word here, a slammed door there, fleeting moments that might have seemed insignificant to anyone else. But to the people living and working in the household, these moments were the first warning signs. Staff members began whispering about arguments no one outside should ever witness, about icy silences that filled rooms and lingered for days, about bursts of anger that left the atmosphere tense and unbreathable. These weren't the private disagreements couples have. They were seismic clashes, the kind that shake the people around them to the core. And yet, the world kept watching the fairy tale unfold. The Instagram posts, the official statements, the interviews that painted a picture of a united front. Nobody outside those walls could imagine that beneath the smiles, the union was fraying fast, unraveling under pressures that were both personal and public. How does a couple so adored, so scrutinized, manage to hide that kind of turmoil? Or maybe they weren't hiding it. They were performing, playing the roles expected of them, while the household staff bore witness to the unraveling in silence. Some of the most shocking revelations came not from the palace itself, but from the people who lived in the shadows of its halls. The staff, the butlers, housekeepers, assistants, and personal aides, those who saw the arguments that no one else did, who were privy to moments that could never reach the tabloids without jeopardizing their careers or safety. They described tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. They described Meghan and Harry locked in fights so intense that staff feared for their own well-being. And the reasons behind these clashes? Fame, money, status, control, forces that magnified every small disagreement into a full-blown crisis. Imagine being a household staff member tasked with serving breakfast while two of the most famous people on earth are locked in a verbal war. Imagine trying to carry out your duties while witnessing explosive anger, shouting matches, and emotional outbursts that leave everyone in the room trembling. Some staff members describe it as being trapped in a pressure cooker where the smallest spark could ignite a massive explosion. Others describe it as living inside a storm with no way to escape, where every day is unpredictable and terrifying. And it wasn't just the fights themselves, it was the emotional roller coaster. One minute, the couple would appear affectionate, tender even, as though nothing had happened. The next, they would erupt over minor slights or misunderstandings. Staff members recount moments where Harry would try to mediate, only to be drawn into the storm, and Meghan's anger would turn toward him in a wave that seemed impossible to contain. Arguments that began over trivial matters would escalate into multi-hour confrontations that left the household reeling. What makes this story so compelling and so tragic is that it wasn't always about anger. Staff described moments of profound disappointment, betrayal, and frustration, when ambitions clashed with expectations, when fame became a weapon rather than a blessing. These were people who had access to the inner workings of a marriage that the world idolized, witnessing cracks in the relationship that most people would never believe could exist in a perfect couple. And yet, the tension was palpable, the drama unrelenting, and the stakes, both personal and public, higher than anyone could imagine. Here's a question for you. If you knew that the people you admired most were hiding chaos behind every smile, Would it change the way you see them? Would it make you question the image of happiness they project? Or would you assume it's just part of being human? The staff reveal that this wasn't just normal marital tension. It was a constant, grinding conflict that seemed to grow in intensity the longer it went unaddressed. And it wasn't about disagreements over chores or simple misunderstandings. It was about control, image, power, and survival in a world where every misstep is magnified 1,000 times. Some staff members even describe incidents so extreme that they can't believe they lived through them. Shouts echoing through the halls, doors slammed with force that rattled picture frames, silence so thick after an argument that it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Others recall moments where Meghan would demand perfection from everyone around her, while Harry oscillated between frustration and helplessness. And through it all, the staff were left to navigate a minefield, caught between witnessing the truth and maintaining loyalty. The irony is undeniable. A couple that left royal life in search of freedom and a calmer existence found themselves trapped in a new kind of pressure cooker. Every fight, every outburst, every disagreement was amplified by fame, wealth, and a constant spotlight. What they sought as liberation became another stage for conflict, and the people closest to them, the household staff, became unwilling spectators to a drama that the world was only beginning to glimpse. And here's the kicker. These are the first accounts of such intense revelations. For years, the staff remained silent, fearing repercussions or dismissal, aware that speaking out could end careers or worse. But now, they have broken that silence, offering an unprecedented look at the private battles of a couple the world thought it knew. Their testimonies challenge everything the public has seen, revealing a marriage that is far more complicated, far more volatile, and far more fascinating than any headline or interview could capture. So what really went wrong? How did two people who appeared so in love end up in a household where fear, tension, and verbal warfare became daily occurrences? And why did it take so long for anyone to speak out? The answers are startling, emotional, and sometimes contradictory. One moment, the accounts reveal tenderness and genuine affection. The next, anger, resentment, and emotional breakdowns. It is a tapestry of human behavior, magnified by wealth, fame, and the relentless scrutiny of the world stage. This story matters now more than ever. With public appearances, media scrutiny, and renewed attention to their post-royal life, understanding the truth behind the palace walls is no longer just gossip. It's a lesson in human complexity, power dynamics, and the perilous intersection of personal ambition and public expectation. The world wants to know what really happens when fame collides with intimacy, when image conflicts with reality, and when love struggles to survive under pressure it was never meant to endure. And just when you think you might have an idea, the staff reveal the moments that redefine everything you thought you knew. Arguments escalate to points that defy belief. Personal boundaries are ignored. Loyalties are tested. And through it all, the question lingers. Is this a marriage doomed by circumstance, by ego, or by something deeper and more complicated? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The fights recorded, the whispers captured, and the secrets held close by those who served them daily would surface, and the world would finally glimpse the full scope of the truth. The calm exterior was about to crack, revealing a reality more intense, more shocking, and far more dramatic than anyone imagined. The story isn't just about Meghan and Harry. It's about power, ambition, fear, and the human cost of a life lived in the relentless glare of the spotlight. And as we delve deeper into the chaos behind the palace walls, one question will haunt you. How do you survive a love story that the world thinks is perfect, when behind closed doors, it is anything but? They say every storm has a beginning, and every tension has its first tremor. For Meghan and Harry, it didn't start with a public outburst or a viral video. It started quietly, in whispers, in fleeting moments that almost seemed ordinary. But for those who worked in the household, they were warnings. The calm before the storm wasn't peaceful at all. It was an uneasy silence, a fragile veneer stretched thin over a pressure cooker of emotions, ambitions, and expectations. Imagine walking through the palace, or their post-royal mansion, with the knowledge that every smile, every polite conversation, could explode at any moment. That was the reality for the staff. They noticed at first subtle changes in tone, the way Meghan's voice could harden over the smallest inconvenience, or how Harry's laughter sometimes masked frustration he refused to voice. These weren't dramatic incidents that made the headlines. They were moments that hinted at what was to come. Staff recall the early days after Meghan moved in. There was excitement, yes. Celebrity, wealth, and royalty were intoxicating, but there was also pressure. Every detail mattered. Every gesture was scrutinized. Meghan, trained in the world of Hollywood image-making, knew how to project confidence and charm, but the staff began to see cracks. Small orders for rearrangements of furniture, unexpected instructions for kitchen staff, tension in how personal spaces were used. Harry, protective but often distracted by media obligations and charitable engagements, sometimes overlooked these signals, which only added to a growing imbalance. It's worth pausing here to consider the psychological pressure on staff. They were not just employees. They were observers of one of the most famous couples in the world. Their loyalty was tested daily. Their discretion was paramount. One misstep could ruin careers or draw unwanted attention. And yet, they saw it all. The subtle snipes, the controlled irritations, the simmering tensions that hinted at conflicts far larger than anyone outside could imagine. In these early days, the couple still maintained appearances in public. Red carpets, charity events, interviews, all polished and perfect. But staff noticed discrepancies that would later make sense in hindsight. One staff member described seeing Meghan frown at a minor household mishap, only to laugh gracefully moments later in front of a camera crew. Harry would step in, a hand on her back, but his eyes revealed a fleeting frustration, quickly masked by a practiced smile. These micro-moments, unnoticed by the world, were indicators of an underlying friction, a tension that was quietly escalating. And then there were the private moments. Staff recall how the couple communicated in hushed tones behind closed doors, their conversations tinged with sharpness or impatience that they would never show publicly. The household felt the weight of these interactions. Some staff tried to maintain distance, focusing only on their duties, while others became unwitting mediators or confidants, caught between witnessing discord and fearing involvement. It wasn't just emotional tension, it was behavioral patterns that suggested stress and control issues. Meghan was meticulous, demanding, and often exacting in ways that sometimes overwhelmed even seasoned staff. Harry, though more relaxed outwardly, had his own pressures, expectations from his family, media scrutiny, and a desire to support Meghan without compromising his own identity. The combination created a dynamic that was fertile ground for conflict, even before any public fallout. One anecdote stands out. A staff member recalls a late evening when Meghan requested a complete rearrangement of the guest rooms after a minor scheduling change. Harry, exhausted from travel and obligations, expressed mild frustration. The exchange escalated quietly, a tension-filled discussion that staff could hear from a nearby corridor. No shouting, no doors slammed, just a clash of wills and expectations. But the energy in the room was palpable, and staff knew this was not an isolated incident. It was the calm before the storm. These moments were not dramatic enough for the tabloids, yet they were significant. They laid the groundwork for understanding how small tensions could snowball into public incidents, and how private dissatisfaction could eventually leak into the open. Staff recall thinking, even then, that if this couple continued down this path without intervention, the inevitable eruptions could be catastrophic. And indeed, they were right. There were also moments of tenderness, fleeting glimpses of the couple's affection, which only heightened the emotional complexity. Staff sometimes witnessed Harry holding Meghan's hand after a long day, or Meghan offering a quiet word of appreciation for a gesture Harry made. These moments made the conflicts harder to process. They blurred the lines between love and tension, showing that even amidst the growing strain, there was still a bond that could complicate emotions for everyone involved. The staff also began noticing patterns in how the couple handled public appearances versus private life. In public, they were charming, poised, and media-savvy, presenting an image of unity. Behind closed doors, their interactions were more raw, more authentic, and more revealing of their vulnerabilities and frustrations. It was a duality that placed enormous pressure on everyone in the household. Staff had to learn when to intervene, when to step back, and when to simply bear witness to the tensions unfolding around them. At this stage, no one expected the private moments to escalate into recorded fights, viral scandals, and public scrutiny on the scale that would later occur. Yet the early signs were clear to those closest to the couple, a volatile mix of fame, wealth, expectation, and personality clashes that, left unchecked, could and would explode. Staff often described a sense of holding their breath, walking through hallways as though stepping lightly over cracks in fragile ice. Every interaction could be a spark, every comment a trigger, every misstep a potential incident. And the more the household staff observed, the more they realized that the calm facade was deceptive. Beneath the elegance, the smiles, and the curated appearances, there was tension simmering, waiting for the right moment to ignite. What looked like normal couple dynamics to the outside world was, in reality, a finely balanced game of emotional negotiation and psychological endurance. This calm period, these subtle tensions, were crucial for understanding what came next. They set the stage for conflicts that would not only involve personal arguments, but also expose the impact of fame and money on relationships. They revealed a couple struggling to maintain their identities while navigating pressures few could understand. And for the staff, these were the moments that prepared them for the chaos that would eventually engulf the household. Moments that would leave lasting impressions and unforgettable memories, some of which were so shocking that sharing them publicly was unthinkable until now. But as the staff would later admit, the first recorded fights, the ones that would be heard, discussed, and dissected for years, were far worse than anything they had imagined. The calm before the storm was just that, a warning, a hint at the turbulence that would come, a subtle tremor before an earthquake. And no one, not even the staff who had seen it all, could have predicted the scale of the drama that awaited them. But what came next would change everything, and the world would finally see the chaos that had been hidden behind carefully crafted smiles and staged appearances. The first recorded fight wasn't something the public ever saw, or could have imagined. It wasn't a staged argument for headlines, nor a fleeting tiff caught by paparazzi. It was real, raw, and so intense that the staff who witnessed it feared they were standing in the middle of something irreparable. For weeks, the household had been holding its breath, navigating subtle tension, whispers, and quiet clashes. But that night, the storm finally broke, and the truth of what was simmering behind the polished public image could no longer be contained. It began with a seemingly small disagreement. Meghan had requested a last-minute rearrangement of her schedule, demanding certain staff attend to specific tasks immediately. Harry, exhausted from travel and obligations, hesitated. He disagreed with the approach, suggesting a calmer, more structured plan. What might have seemed trivial to anyone else ignited a spark. Meghan reportedly snapped, her voice rising sharply in ways that startled even the most seasoned staff. The hallway, once quiet and orderly, became charged with tension. Staff described the room like a battlefield. Every word exchanged seemed like a volley, every gesture amplified by emotion. Doors were slammed, not violently, but with enough force to rattle picture frames and create a shockwave of unease. Staff watched, frozen, unsure whether to intervene, retreat, or simply observe. Some whispered to each other, barely audible, noting the shock in each other's eyes. This was not normal household disagreement. This was a full-blown emotional eruption, and no one had seen it coming. One staff member recalled standing near the doorway, listening as voices escalated. Meghan's tone sharp, commanding, almost imperious. Harry's, though quieter at first, grew firmer, frustrated, and defensive. There were moments when Meghan's words cut like a knife, filled with sharp indignation. And yet, there were moments of disbelief on Harry's face, as though he couldn't believe this was happening over what seemed like a small issue. To the staff, the contradiction between the public image of the couple and what they were witnessing was staggering. The fight didn't just involve raised voices. There were subtle psychological maneuvers, attempts to assert dominance, and power struggles that left everyone in the room tense. Staff described watching Meghan pace back and forth, voice oscillating between controlled anger and emotional outburst, while Harry's gestures became increasingly defensive, hands raised not in aggression but in exasperation. The air was thick with a mix of fear, frustration, and emotional intensity, so palpable it felt almost tangible. What made this fight especially shocking was the context. The couple had spent months projecting unity and happiness to the world. Every interview, every social media post, every public appearance reinforced the image of a harmonious partnership. And yet, behind closed doors, it was a completely different story. The staff, who had been quietly observing tensions in the days and weeks prior, now realized that the earlier incidents were mere precursors. This fight revealed the depth and intensity of the conflict that had been building, unchecked, in private. Staff also noted something unexpected. Despite the intensity, there were moments of tenderness and vulnerability. At one point, Meghan reportedly paused, tears welling in her eyes, as if she were wrestling with the conflict within herself. Harry, too, showed flashes of emotion, his frustration mingled with concern, confusion, and exhaustion. These fleeting moments of humanity made the tension even more complicated for staff. They weren't just witnessing anger. They were witnessing a collision of conflicting emotions, raw and unfiltered, magnified by the pressures of fame, expectation, and relentless scrutiny. The fight lasted longer than anyone expected. Hours, according to some accounts, with staff remaining nearby, but careful not to intrude. They described the room as an emotional pressure cooker, where every word, gesture, and reaction had consequences. Even minor comments from staff, questions about logistics or timing, were met with sharp rebukes, as if anyone present could ignite a larger explosion. The household became a stage for conflict that no one outside could understand, a storm contained within walls that were meant to be private. It wasn't just the volume or intensity of the voices that shocked staff. It was the psychological complexity. Meghan's arguments, though heated, were often strategic, pointing out inconsistencies, mistakes, or perceived slights. Harry's responses, while often restrained, reflected both a desire to mediate and a deep frustration at having to navigate a labyrinth of expectations. Staff observed how past grievances, unspoken frustrations, and underlying pressures from media and public life all fused into a volatile mix, turning even mundane disagreements into explosive encounters. This first recorded fight also revealed the emotional toll on those around them. Staff reported feeling physically and mentally drained after witnessing the confrontation. Some had trouble sleeping, replaying the arguments in their minds. Others felt trapped, uncertain how to protect themselves while maintaining professionalism. Even for seasoned employees, accustomed to navigating high-pressure households, this was unprecedented. The magnitude of the clash left them shaken, a realization dawning that this was not a one-off incident, but a glimpse into an ongoing pattern of behavior. The aftermath was equally revealing. Once the argument subsided, silence filled the household. Staff moved quietly, adjusting to the residual tension, unsure how to restore normalcy. Meghan and Harry retreated into separate spaces, each processing the conflict in their own way. The room remained charged with emotional energy, a reminder of the intensity that had just unfolded. Staff quietly shared glances, unspoken acknowledgement that what they had witnessed was extraordinary, and perhaps, in ways, dangerous. What makes this fight so compelling, and what sets it apart from other marital disagreements, is the way fame and wealth amplified every dynamic. Minor slights became magnified. Small disagreements turned into emotional avalanches. The couple's public image of poise and composure was a stark contrast to the intensity witnessed in private. Staff, who had no agenda other than to perform their duties, became witnesses to a drama that highlighted not only human emotion, but also the consequences of living life under a microscope. And yet, despite the chaos, there were hints of restraint, moments where both Meghan and Harry seemed aware of the stakes. They didn't throw objects. They didn't cross physical boundaries. This wasn't violence in the physical sense. It was emotional warfare, psychological dueling that left the room tense, hearts racing, and staff acutely aware that they were seeing something the world was never meant to see. Afterward, staff would reflect on what this fight meant for the future. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the opening salvo in a series of conflicts that would escalate over time. They realized that the calm days leading up to this moment were temporary, a fragile veneer over a marriage already under strain. Every subsequent disagreement, every tension-filled interaction, would be colored by this initial eruption, setting a pattern that would repeat and intensify in ways no one could predict. And then there's the question everyone outside the household would eventually ask. What caused it? Was it stress, ambition, external pressures, or something deeper within the relationship? Staff insights suggest it was a combination of all these factors. Fame and wealth were catalysts, magnifying personal insecurities and latent frustrations. Unmet expectations and miscommunication acted as tinder, and the dynamics of public scrutiny added oxygen to the flame. By the time the first fight erupted, the household was already a highly combustible environment. This first recorded fight was a turning point. Staff would later describe it as the moment they truly understood the complexity and volatility of the couple's relationship. It wasn't about a single incident. It was about patterns, underlying tensions, and the way personal and public pressures collided. For Staff, it was the moment that redefined their understanding of the couple, the household, and the delicate balance that had previously existed. But what came next would escalate far beyond even this initial eruption. The Staff's observations would reveal patterns of anger, control, and emotional manipulation that even they hadn't anticipated. The first recorded fight was just the beginning, a prelude to a series of confrontations that would shock anyone who thought they understood what life behind closed doors looked like for the Sussexes. And the question that would haunt Staff, and eventually the public, remained: how long could this tension last before it spilled completely into the open? How long before the private battles could no longer be contained, and the world finally saw the reality behind the image? The storm had begun, and the next chapter would only make it more intense, more unrelenting, and far more revealing. It's one thing to hear about tension behind palace walls. It's another to witness it in full force, up close, and in moments that leave you questioning what you thought you knew about someone. Meghan Markle's temper, according to Staff accounts, was not subtle. It wasn't a fleeting annoyance or a momentary flare-up. It was a force, intense, commanding, and sometimes unpredictable, that shaped the household atmosphere in ways that no one outside could imagine. Staff describe her temper as a mix of precision, intensity, and theatricality. When it flared, it could dominate the room, commanding attention and controlling the emotional climate. But it wasn't just volume or anger. It was the combination of sharp words, piercing glares, and exacting expectations. Every instruction, every request, even minor mistakes, could trigger responses that left the Staff tense, alert, and often walking on eggshells. They had to learn quickly. One wrong move, one delayed response, could set off a cascade of emotional reactions that were exhausting to witness. What made Meghan's temper particularly intense, Staff say, was how personal it felt. It wasn't just about tasks being done incorrectly or schedules being off. It was about control, image, and maintaining the perception of perfection. Staff recount stories of being asked to redo arrangements repeatedly until they met her exacting standards, of minor inconveniences spiraling into extended confrontations, and of the emotional impact these incidents had not just on her husband, but on everyone around. One example stands out vividly. A staff member described a morning when Meghan discovered that a minor detail in the household schedule had not been followed precisely. Her reaction, though composed at first, escalated within minutes into sharp words and pointed criticism, not just directed at Staff, but reverberating through the halls. Harry attempted to intervene, to calm the situation, but Staff observed the tension between them, the push and pull of power, authority, and frustration. Even after the initial words were spoken, the emotional residue lingered, creating a charged atmosphere that could not be ignored. Staff also noted that Meghan's anger could be strategic. It wasn't always impulsive. Sometimes, it appeared calculated, a way to assert dominance, to reinforce authority, or to express dissatisfaction with a situation she found unacceptable. Observing this, Staff learned to anticipate moods, to predict which interactions might trigger tension, and to navigate a landscape where emotional volatility was part of the job. For them, the challenge wasn't just completing tasks, it was surviving emotionally, mentally, and professionally. Interestingly, the explosive moments were often followed by periods of calm or even affection. Staff recall seeing Meghan suddenly shift from sharp criticism to warmth or humor, creating a confusing dynamic. This unpredictability heightened the tension, making it difficult for anyone to feel entirely secure in their interactions. Was this a personality quirk, a coping mechanism, or a deeper reflection of personal pressures? Staff didn't always know, but they learned that the emotional oscillation was as intense as the outbursts themselves. The impact on Harry was equally significant. Staff observed that he often bore the brunt of her frustration, caught between defending himself, maintaining composure, and managing the household dynamics. In private moments, Harry would sometimes retreat, a hand over his face, or attempt to de-escalate situations quietly, hoping to contain the storm. But containment was rarely successful. Meghan's intensity had a way of pushing boundaries, challenging assumptions, and drawing out reactions that might otherwise have remained hidden. A key aspect staff highlighted was how Meghan's temper affected the broader household environment. Even employees not directly involved in confrontations felt the residual tension. Kitchens, corridors, and common areas could carry the emotional weight of arguments long after they ended. Staff described moments of nervousness, hesitancy, and hyper-awareness, as if the walls themselves held the echoes of confrontation. The energy in the house was, in many ways, dictated by her mood. A powerful reminder of the emotional influence she wielded. But it wasn't just about anger for anger's sake. Staff noticed patterns that suggested Meghan's temper was intertwined with deeper insecurities, expectations, and pressures. Every confrontation seemed layered with complexity, professional expectations, personal frustrations, and the relentless glare of public attention. Staff began to see the temper not as an isolated personality trait, but as a response to circumstances. An interplay between control, fear, and the need to assert agency in a highly scrutinized environment. Staff also reported moments when Meghan's temper revealed vulnerability beneath the surface. During heated arguments, there were flashes of exhaustion, worry, or doubt. Sometimes, in private, she would show signs of regret or reflection, as if aware of the consequences of her intensity. These glimpses of humanity made the household dynamics even more complicated. Staff weren't just managing anger. They were navigating a complex web of emotions that could shift unpredictably, making every interaction potentially fraught. One incident, in particular, highlighted the extremes. Staff describe a day when a disagreement escalated to the point where Meghan's voice echoed through multiple rooms. Harry attempted to mediate, offering calm explanations and suggestions, but staff noted the tension in his gestures and the tightness of his expressions. The confrontation lasted for hours, leaving staff drained and emotionally shaken. This wasn't just a fight. It was a display of psychological intensity that demonstrated how deeply personal and public pressures could collide. The consequences extended beyond immediate emotional strain. Staff recall the lingering tension, the careful navigation of subsequent interactions, and the fear of triggering further outbursts. Every decision, every minor error, became potentially significant. The household became a delicate ecosystem where emotional balance required constant vigilance. Staff learned to read cues, tones of voice, gestures, even subtle facial expressions, to anticipate the next wave of intensity. Yet, even amidst this volatility, staff observed moments of strategy and calculation. Meghan's temper, at times, seemed designed to achieve specific outcomes: compliance, attention, or resolution of a problem her way. It was rarely indiscriminate. Staff realized that navigating these dynamics required not only awareness, but also emotional intelligence, resilience, and a capacity for discretion that went beyond ordinary expectations. For Harry, the experience was profoundly challenging. Staff described moments where he attempted to shield the household from the brunt of her frustration, stepping in to defuse situations or absorb criticism. At times, his interventions were effective, bringing temporary calm. Other times, they seemed only to fuel further tension, as both personal emotions and external pressures collided. The staff, caught in the middle, were forced to adapt, learning to anticipate the emotional trajectory of arguments and respond with care, timing, and professionalism. The impact of Meghan's explosive temper extended beyond the household. Staff noted that these private dynamics had public consequences, influencing decisions about appearances, interviews, and public messaging. Arguments in private often translated into careful management of public image, highlighting the intricate connection between personal behavior and professional considerations. Staff were acutely aware of this duality, witnessing the tension between private reality and public perception, a dichotomy that added layers of complexity to their work. As the weeks progressed, staff noticed a pattern. Meghan's temper, Harry's responses, and the resulting household tension formed a repeating cycle. Minor incidents could escalate into full-blown confrontations, followed by periods of calm or affection, only to restart with the next trigger. Staff described this cycle as exhausting, emotionally draining, and sometimes frightening. They began to recognize the early warning signs, learning when to intervene, when to step back, and when to simply observe, a delicate balancing act that defined their daily experience. And while Meghan's temper was a central factor, it interacted with other stressors: media scrutiny, family expectations, and the pressure to maintain a flawless public image. Staff observed how these external pressures magnified private tensions, creating a feedback loop that intensified emotional volatility. Every disagreement, every clash of wills, became more charged, more consequential, and more visible, at least to those within the household. But perhaps most revealing was how staff perceived the emotional stakes for both Meghan and Harry. They weren't just arguing. They were struggling to reconcile personal identity, public expectation, and private ambition. Each confrontation revealed vulnerabilities, aspirations, and frustrations that staff had never expected to witness. It was, in many ways, a masterclass in human emotion, magnified by fame, wealth, and constant attention. And then came moments that left staff truly shaken. Incidents so intense, so unpredictable, that they realized no one outside could ever comprehend the full extent of the emotional energy within the household. Arguments that lasted hours, strategic use of voice and gestures to assert authority, subtle psychological maneuvers to achieve compliance, all played out in ways that were both mesmerizing and terrifying. Staff understood, in that moment, that the marriage they served was more volatile than any headline, more complex than any interview, and far more dramatic than anyone had imagined. But what came next would reveal that Meghan's temper, while intense, was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The interplay between her explosiveness, Harry's responses, and the pressures of fame, fortune, and public expectation would escalate in ways that shocked staff, and, eventually, the world. The intensity they had seen thus far was only the beginning. It's easy to focus on Meghan's explosive temper, and many accounts do. But what often gets overlooked is how Harry, for all his charm and public composure, reached his own breaking points. Staff who worked closely with the couple described moments where his frustration, long simmering beneath polite restraint, erupted in ways that revealed the intense pressure he faced and how it shaped the dynamics of the household. For weeks, Harry had attempted to mediate, deflect, and contain conflict. He absorbed criticism, tried to smooth tensions, and even shouldered responsibility for preventing arguments from escalating. But staff noticed subtle signs of strain, tightened jawlines, clenched fists, and restless pacing. He became quieter in public appearances following private conflicts, a flicker of fatigue behind his ever-present smile. Staff knew it wasn't just exhaustion from duties or travel. It was the emotional toll of a household in constant upheaval, where personal space and boundaries were constantly challenged. The first major eruption from Harry was unexpected. Staff recount an evening when Meghan's temper flared over a minor household detail, something trivial, like a schedule adjustment or a wardrobe request. Normally, Harry would respond with calm reasoning or gentle humor to diffuse the situation. But on this occasion, frustration reached a threshold. His words were firmer, sharper, and carried an intensity staff had rarely witnessed. The clash that followed was not just about the immediate disagreement. It was the collision of built-up stress, exhaustion, and the pressure of maintaining public composure while private chaos raged. One staff member described it as watching a dam break. Harry's frustration wasn't explosive in the theatrical sense. It was deliberate, raw, and imbued with the weight of long-suppressed emotion. Staff recall the sharpness in his tone, the controlled but unmistakable anger, and the way it reverberated through the household. Meghan, initially stunned by the intensity, pushed back, creating a high-stakes verbal duel that left staff uncertain how to respond. Their training, their instincts, and their patience were all tested in ways they had never imagined. It wasn't only the argument itself that shocked staff, it was the context. Harry had spent months attempting to manage not only his spouse's temper, but the public narrative surrounding their life. He juggled royal obligations, media scrutiny, and personal ambition while trying to keep the household functioning smoothly. The accumulated stress was immense, and when it finally surfaced, it did so with a clarity and force that left staff scrambling to process the magnitude of the moment. Interestingly, staff observed that Harry's frustration often carried an undercurrent of care. His anger was rarely aimless. It was directed at issues that mattered deeply to him, whether maintaining fairness, protecting staff, or asserting his own perspective in a relationship that sometimes felt one-sided. This mixture of emotional investment and exhaustion created an intensity that could be shocking to witness, even to those who had seen the household at its tensest. Staff recall specific incidents where Harry's frustration escalated over extended periods. One evening, after a long series of misunderstandings, Harry reportedly raised his voice, not aggressively, but firmly, over a scheduling conflict. Meghan responded with her own intensity, and the argument stretched over hours. Staff were left in a state of heightened alert, walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate each twist in the conversation. They described the emotional tension in the house as almost palpable, a charged energy that seemed to warp the very atmosphere. The impact on staff extended beyond the immediate moment. They had to adapt to new dynamics, anticipate potential triggers, and sometimes intervene subtly to prevent further escalation. One staff member admitted feeling physically and emotionally drained, noting that even routine tasks became stressful when they carried the possibility of triggering tension between the couple. The household was no longer just a place of work, it was an emotional battleground, and staff were caught in the crossfire. Staff also observed that Harry's frustration often arose from the collision of personal values with public pressures. He wanted to maintain dignity, fairness, and composure, yet he was constantly navigating an environment where his private and public lives intersected in stressful ways. This tension was magnified by Meghan's temper, their differences in communication, and the constant pressure to appear unified. Staff recognized that Harry's eruptions were rarely impulsive. They were the accumulation of stress, responsibility, and the psychological weight of trying to manage a household, a marriage, and public expectations simultaneously. Another factor staff highlighted was Harry's protective instinct. When arguments escalated to points where staff or household operations were affected, he sometimes expressed frustration in defense of others. He became a mediator, a buffer, and a shield, roles that added to his emotional burden. Witnessing this, staff realized that his frustration was not simply personal anger. It was deeply intertwined with responsibility, care, and the desire to maintain equilibrium in a household that was anything but stable. The consequences of Harry's outbursts were significant. Staff described moments where the household energy shifted dramatically following his expressions of frustration. Silence would descend, nerves would tighten, and everyone would become hyper-aware of their movements. It was clear that Harry's emotions, when unleashed, had the power to influence the entire environment, just as Meghan's temper did. The combination of their emotional volatility created a household atmosphere that was intense, unpredictable, and exhausting for everyone involved. Staff also noticed patterns in how Harry and Meghan interacted during these moments. Arguments were rarely linear. They ebbed and flowed, each partner testing boundaries, asserting perspectives, and responding to perceived slights. Staff described a choreography of tension, where emotional cues, gestures, and subtle cues dictated the flow of conflict. Observing this, staff had to learn not just to respond, but to anticipate, navigating an emotional minefield that shifted with every word spoken. Importantly, these incidents were not isolated. Staff recount that Harry's frustration, once it emerged, often led to a series of cascading conflicts. Minor disagreements became amplified, emotional responses intensified, and the household became a pressure cooker of unresolved tension. Staff understood that the first eruptions were only the beginning. The dynamic between Meghan's temper and Harry's frustration set the stage for a series of confrontations that would test everyone in the household. What made these moments particularly striking was the human complexity on display. Harry's frustration, though intense, revealed vulnerability, exhaustion, and care. Meghan's responses, equally intense, reflected her own pressures and expectations. Staff witnessed a nuanced interplay of personalities, emotions, and external stressors that few could fully comprehend. It wasn't just anger. It was a reflection of high-stakes emotional labor under extraordinary conditions. And as staff began to see the pattern emerge, it became clear that the combination of Meghan's explosive temper and Harry's pent-up frustration was creating an environment that was volatile, unpredictable, and emotionally taxing. The household, once a structured and ordered place, had transformed into a space defined by tension, anticipation, and the constant negotiation of emotional boundaries. But perhaps the most unsettling realization for staff was that these confrontations were only escalating. Each outburst, each argument, seemed to set the stage for the next, creating a cycle that was difficult to break. They began to understand that the household was no longer merely managing tasks. It was managing emotions, anticipation, and psychological pressure on a daily basis. The environment was charged, and no one could predict when the next eruption would occur or how intense it would be. And just when staff thought they had reached a limit, the next chapter would reveal how the pressure, fame, and personal stakes would ignite conflicts that were far more intense, revealing dimensions of Meghan and Harry's relationship that few had ever seen and none outside the household could imagine. For years, the world saw only the polished image of Meghan and Harry, a couple navigating fame and royal life with grace, charm, and apparent unity. But behind the scenes, household staff were living in a very different reality, one that revealed tension, fear, and moments of emotional chaos. And for the first time, some of those staff members began to speak out, offering unprecedented insight into the private life of the Sussexes. Their accounts are not gossip. They are eyewitness testimonies from people who were present during the conflicts, the arguments, and the emotionally charged moments that the public never witnessed. The decision to speak out was not easy. Staff had careers, reputations, and sometimes even personal safety to consider. In households of this magnitude, discretion is paramount, and loyalty is expected. But the accumulation of experiences, intense arguments, explosive outbursts, and the ongoing psychological pressure of working in a volatile environment push some to finally share their perspective. What they reveal is shocking, illuminating, and at times heartbreaking. Staff recall incidents that ranged from verbal confrontations to subtle power struggles. One described witnessing Meghan's temper erupt over small, seemingly inconsequential details, with Harry attempting to mediate but occasionally being drawn into the storm. Another staff member spoke of the fear that accompanied these arguments, the emotional tension so intense that it was physically felt in the room, making it difficult to breathe, speak, or even move confidently. These accounts paint a picture of a household in emotional turbulence, where the staff were not only witnesses but participants in managing an environment fraught with intensity. The first revelation is about the nature of the arguments themselves. Staff emphasized that these were not ordinary marital disagreements. They were conflicts magnified by fame, public expectation, and the constant scrutiny of media attention. Every word, every gesture, carried layers of meaning, intentional or not. Meghan's explosive moments often intersected with Harry's frustration, creating confrontations that were psychologically complex and emotionally charged. Staff describe it as living inside a pressure cooker, where the smallest spark could ignite a major eruption. Some staff accounts are deeply personal, describing how they themselves were affected by the atmosphere. One household member recalled sleepless nights, replaying arguments in their mind, and trying to anticipate emotional triggers to avoid further escalation. Another mentioned feeling physically and emotionally drained, caught between performing duties and witnessing intense emotional dynamics. The strain on staff highlights just how extreme the household environment had become, a reality hidden behind a public image of elegance and calm. Staff also highlight the interplay between public image and private reality. The couple's carefully curated appearances masked what was happening behind closed doors. Staff described the challenge of maintaining a facade of unity while the household was emotionally turbulent. There were moments when Meghan and Harry projected affection, charm, and composure for cameras or visiting guests, only for that energy to collapse into tension the moment the door closed. Staff were acutely aware of this duality, which added layers of complexity to their experience. Another key revelation from staff is the emotional toll of being caught in the middle. Many described feeling like mediators or buffers during arguments, carefully navigating the household dynamics to prevent further escalation. Some found themselves providing support not only to Harry or Meghan, but also to fellow staff members affected by the tension. The mental load was immense, requiring constant vigilance, emotional intelligence, and discretion. For some, it was a test of endurance, patience, and professional skill unlike anything they had encountered before. Staff accounts also detail how these conflicts affected decision-making within the household. Requests, instructions, and daily routines became entangled with emotional tension. A simple task could trigger an argument, while arguments could reverberate for hours, influencing interactions long after the initial flare-up. Staff learned to anticipate moods, read subtle cues, and adapt their behavior to minimize conflict. This emotional labor, while invisible to the public, was a central aspect of their role and shaped their experience of working within the household. Some staff accounts reveal moments of extreme tension that were nearly impossible to manage. One recounted an evening when a disagreement escalated for hours, with voices raised, gestures sharp, and both Meghan and Harry emotionally invested in asserting their perspectives. The argument created an atmosphere that left staff on edge, unsure how to act, and deeply aware that any misstep could make matters worse. Observing this, staff recognized the complexity of the relationship and the high emotional stakes involved. Staff also offer insight into how fame and public pressure amplified these dynamics. The couple was constantly aware of their public image, which often created additional stress in private. Meghan's expectations, Harry's protective instincts, and the desire to maintain composure in front of cameras and visitors combined to create a volatile environment. Staff noted that conflicts were rarely about trivial matters alone. They were about perception, control, and the pressure to live up to an impossible standard set by both the media and their own ambitions. In addition to detailing arguments and emotional strain, staff described moments of unpredictability that made the household particularly challenging. Meghan's temperament could shift suddenly, from calm to fiery, while Harry's frustration could surface quietly before bursting unexpectedly. This volatility meant that staff had to remain hyper-aware at all times, adjusting their behavior, anticipating reactions, and sometimes intervening subtly to prevent escalation. The role required constant psychological alertness, and even seasoned employees found it exhausting and emotionally taxing. Staff also reveal how conflicts between Meghan and Harry influenced the broader household atmosphere. When tensions flared, even staff not directly involved felt the impact. Kitchens, hallways, and common areas were charged with emotional energy, and staff often had to navigate these spaces carefully to avoid becoming collateral in an argument. The psychological pressure extended beyond immediate confrontations, creating an environment that was continuously tense and unpredictable. One particularly striking account described a day when Meghan's demands, combined with Harry's frustration, created a multi-hour confrontation that enveloped the household. Staff were left anxious, fatigued, and unsure how to respond. The emotional energy lingered long after the argument ended, affecting every interaction and task for the rest of the day. Observing this, staff realized that the household was no longer just a workplace. It was an emotional ecosystem, constantly responding to the shifting dynamics between two highly emotional, high-profile individuals. Another revelation from staff is how these conflicts affected relationships within the household itself. Tensions between Meghan and Harry sometimes created divisions among staff, forcing employees to choose sides, manage loyalties, and navigate interpersonal challenges in addition to their professional responsibilities. Staff described a careful balancing act, attempting to maintain neutrality while supporting their colleagues and maintaining professional duties. This layer of complexity added further strain to an already high-pressure environment. Staff accounts also highlight the long-term impact of witnessing these conflicts. Many reported ongoing emotional strain, fatigue, and anxiety even after arguments ended. Some struggled to maintain perspective, processing the intensity of private confrontations while performing public-facing duties. The psychological impact on staff underscores the depth of tension within the household and the challenges of maintaining emotional stability in an environment defined by volatility. And yet, despite the intensity, staff also note moments of affection, humor, and tenderness between Meghan and Harry. These glimpses of normalcy made the conflicts even more striking, as the oscillation between warmth and anger created a roller coaster of emotions that staff had to navigate daily. The contrast between public appearances and private reality was stark, and staff understood that what the world saw was only a fraction of the truth. But perhaps the most shocking aspect, according to staff, is what these conflicts reveal about the intersection of fame, power, and personal relationships. The pressure to maintain public image, combined with private emotional intensity, created a volatile mix that tested the limits of patience, loyalty, and endurance. Staff were witnesses to a reality few could imagine. A marriage simultaneously scrutinized, pressured, and emotionally charged in ways that left everyone in the household navigating a constant tightrope. And as staff began to speak out, sharing these insights with journalists and the public for the first time, the narrative of Meghan and Harry's life was transformed. No longer were they just the fairy tale couple who left royal duties behind. They were human, complex, flawed, and living with tensions that few outside the household could truly comprehend. But what came next would push the tension even further. Staff accounts reveal that the conflicts were about to escalate, fueled by fame, ambition, and the pressures of a world watching every move. The household was entering a new phase of volatility, one that would challenge every assumption about the couple and leave staff, and eventually the public, stunned. If there's one thing the household staff made clear, it's that the tension between Meghan and Harry was never just about personal disagreements. Behind the arguments, behind the outbursts, and behind the carefully orchestrated public appearances, there was a deeper, more insidious force at play: fame and money. Staff accounts reveal that these two elements were not just background factors. They were central to nearly every conflict, shaping behavior, fueling tension, and amplifying the stakes of even minor disagreements. From the beginning, fame exerted a unique pressure. Every word, gesture, or decision was magnified, recorded, and scrutinized, not only by the press, but also by social media, fan communities, and public opinion. Staff describe an environment where nothing was private, where the knowledge that cameras, or even rumors, could turn a small incident into a global story created constant tension. Meghan, acutely aware of her public image, was meticulous, demanding, and sometimes volatile in managing how she was perceived. Harry, aware of the royal legacy he represented, carried the weight of historical scrutiny and public expectation. Together, this created a potent mix of personal and external pressures. Money, too, played a critical role. Staff recount instances where financial decisions, lifestyle expectations, and management of household resources became flashpoints for conflict. Requests for lavish arrangements, high standards for accommodations, and strict attention to detail often led to disputes, not out of malice, but out of the pressure to maintain appearances and meet perceived expectations. Every decision had symbolic weight. A gift, a meal, a schedule, or even a simple purchase could carry implications about status, control, and priorities. Staff quickly realized that in this household, nothing was purely functional. Every act was interpreted as a reflection of power, intention, or influence. Staff describe moments where fame and money intertwined to create particularly intense confrontations. For example, disagreements over event planning, appearances, or charitable obligations sometimes escalated because they were not just tasks. They were statements about public perception and personal legacy. Meghan, in particular, was reported to have strong opinions about how every detail reflected on her image, while Harry often had to balance those demands with his own priorities, security concerns, and the need to manage household staff. The collision of these factors frequently produced arguments that were as strategic as they were emotional. One staff member recounted a specific conflict over a high-profile appearance, where Meghan's insistence on precise control over every element, from attire to timing to messaging, clashed with Harry's practical concerns. The argument began as a logistical disagreement, but quickly escalated into a multi-hour confrontation filled with raised voices, pointed criticism, and emotional intensity. Staff watched as fame and money became catalysts for conflict, transforming ordinary disagreements into emotionally charged standoffs. The stakes were further amplified by the couple's desire for autonomy. Having stepped away from traditional royal duties, they faced the challenge of creating a new identity while managing the pressures of global attention. Staff noted that this desire for independence often collided with expectations, both internal and external, resulting in disagreements over how resources should be managed, how public appearances should be handled, and how household operations should be structured. The result was a household where every decision, large or small, was infused with significance.